You're a British admiral who's spent 3 decades coordinating naval operations. You've seen the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow. You've orchestrated the Dunkirk evacuation. You understand naval logistics at a scale most people can't even imagine. And then, one morning in January 1944, you look out your office window and see something that makes you question whether you've actually understood anything at all. Plymouth Harbor, January 1944. Admiral Sir Charles Little, Commander-in-Chief of Portsmouth, stood at his office window watching another convoy glide into the Sound. 18 American Liberty ships, their gray hulls riding low with cargo, their decks stacked with crates and vehicles lashed down under tarpaulins. The vessels moved with the mechanical precision that had become characteristic of American operations, each maintaining exact intervals, each captain following approach vectors plotted weeks in advance. Little had been counting. This was the 43rd such convoy in the past 2 weeks. 43 convoys. He'd been in the Royal Navy since before the Great War. He'd seen naval buildups, fleet concentrations, major operations. He understood the rhythm of military logistics, the way men and ships accumulated before major offensives. But this wasn't accumulation, this was something else entirely. He turned to his logistics officer, a commander who'd been working 16-hour days trying to find space for the endless stream of arrivals. How many total now American vessels currently in our port? The officer consulted his clipboard, running his finger down columns of numbers that seemed to grow longer every time Little asked this question. 217 as of this morning's count, sir. That's not including the landing craft still in construction at the local yards, or the vessels we expect next week. Portsmouth signals they've got another convoy of 30 for inbound, due tomorrow afternoon. Little nodded slowly, processing numbers that should have been impossible. 217 American vessels in Plymouth alone. And Plymouth was just one port among many along the southern coast, all filling with American ships at the same relentless pace. He'd approved the allocations, he'd reviewed the planning documents. He'd coordinated with his American counterparts. He'd understood intellectually what Operation Overlord required. Understanding numbers on a planning document and watching those numbers materialize as steel hulls crowding out every square meter of harbor space were entirely different experiences. Here's what nobody tells you about seeing industrial might in action. It doesn't arrive all at once in some dramatic reveal. It accumulates. Day after day, week after week, convoy after convoy, until one morning you realize the familiar landscape of your career has transformed into something you no longer recognize. Little had known these waters for decades. He could navigate Plymouth Sound blind. He knew every anchorage, every depth, every current. Now, looking out his window, he barely recognized it. The first American vessels had arrived in Britain for Operation Overlord planning in late 1943, small numbers initially. A few destroyers, some transports, the advanced elements of what would become the Western Naval Task Force under Rear Admiral Alan Kirk. British planners had reviewed the American commitment, understood the allocations, approved the integration of American forces into the overall plan. They'd seen the manifests, studied the capabilities, coordinated the logistics. They'd done everything by the book. They'd planned for a large American contribution. They'd even planned for a very large American contribution. What they hadn't quite planned for was this. By February, the trickle had become a flood that threatened to overwhelm every harbor on the southern coast. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay maintained his headquarters at Southwark House near Portsmouth, a Georgian mansion that had been requisitioned for the planning of what everyone hoped would be the decisive operation of the war. Ramsay was the Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief for Operation Neptune, the naval component of the invasion. A meticulous planner with a mind for complex logistics, he'd orchestrated the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, managing to extract over 300,000 troops from a collapsing military situation. He understood chaos, he understood improvisation under pressure. He understood how to coordinate hundreds of vessels in constrained waters under enemy fire. He thought he understood what the invasion fleet would look like. He'd spent months coordinating with Admiral Kirk, reviewing American ship allocations, planning the intricate choreography of the largest amphibious assault in history. The operational plan called for nearly 7,000 vessels total. The Americans had committed to providing roughly 3,000 of them. 3,000 vessels. Ramsey had written that number in countless reports. He discussed it in meetings with Eisenhower, with Montgomery, with Churchill. He coordinated with Admiral Kirk on their deployment, their organization, their integration into British-controlled sectors. But there's a peculiar psychological gap between approving 3,000 vessels in a planning document and watching them actually arrive. Numbers on paper have no weight, no presence, no physical reality. They're abstractions, comfortable and manageable. 3,000 vessels sounds large, but it's still just words on a page, ink on paper, a commitment on a manifest. Real ships are different. Real ships displace water, they require anchorage. They need fuel, supplies, maintenance. They take up space in harbors that were already crowded before they arrived. They require coordination, communication, organization. They transform abstract planning into concrete reality that has to be managed hour by hour, day by day. In early March, Ramsey stood on the deck of HMS Larks, his headquarters ship, watching another American convoy enter the Solent. He developed a habit of observing the arrivals, partly from professional necessity. He needed to understand what resources were actually available and partly from something like fascination. The sheer logistical achievement of what he was witnessing demanded attention. He raised his binoculars and began counting. 22 LSTs, landing ship tank, the ungainly vessels that looked like floating warehouses with their flat bottoms and massive bow doors. Each LST could carry 20 Sherman tanks or 33 trucks, plus crews and supplies. They were purpose-built for amphibious assault, designed to beach themselves, discharge their cargo directly onto sand, then retract and return for another load. The Americans had started building them in 1942. Now, less than 2 years later, they were arriving in Britain by the dozen. Behind the LSTs came a line of smaller landing craft. LCILS, Landing Craft Infantry Large, each designed to carry 200 troops directly to the beach. Ramsey counted 34 of them in this convoy alone, their distinctive profiles cutting through the gray water of the Solent. These vessels had been in American shipyards 6 weeks ago. Now they were here, ready for integration into the invasion plan. His flag lieutenant approached, carrying another manifest. The young officer had bags under his eyes. Everyone at headquarters was running on too little sleep and too much coffee, trying to keep pace with the American arrivals. Sir, the convoy manifest shows 41 more LSTs scheduled to arrive at Plymouth tomorrow. Another convoy of 67 LC is the day after that. Portland is requesting permission to anchor vessels outside the harbor proper. They've run out of space. Ramsey lowered his binoculars. Where are they putting them all? Plymouth reporting they're anchoring them in lines extending 3 miles into the Sound, sir. Falmouth has them packed so tight their harbor master says you could walk from ship to ship across the entire harbor without getting your feet wet. This wasn't exaggeration. British port commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports about space constraints. The southern coast of England had become one vast naval parking lot, with American vessels filling every available anchorage, every harbor, every inlet deep enough to float a hull. Harbors that had seemed spacious in peacetime now resembled industrial warehouses, packed to absolute capacity with steel hulls. And still the convoys kept coming, but here's where the story gets really interesting. The Americans weren't just bringing ships, they were bringing infrastructure. In April, British engineers at Portland watched with professional fascination and perhaps a touch of professional jealousy as American Seabees. Construction battalion personnel assembled floating piers that looked like they'd been built in a proper shipyard, not improvised on a beach. These weren't makeshift docks cobbled together from available materials. They were engineered structures prefabricated in American factories shipped across the Atlantic in sections, and assembled with industrial efficiency that left the British engineers shaking their heads in disbelief. The Americans had anticipated that British port facilities wouldn't be sufficient for their needs, so they'd simply built their own and brought them along. Commander Edward Ellsberg, a British liaison officer working with the American forces, wrote in his diary one evening, "The Yanks have arrived with enough concrete and steel to build a small city. They're not adapting to our ports, they're building their own alongside ours. Yesterday, I watched them assemble a pier in 6 hours that would have taken our engineers 3 days. They work in shifts around the clock, with floodlights at night. The noise never stops, neither do they." The skill became impossible to ignore, impossible to rationalize as just another military buildup. By late April, British civilians living along the southern coast found their familiar landscapes transformed beyond recognition. Harbors they'd known their entire lives, where they could count the vessels and name half the captains, had become forests of masts and superstructures stretching to the horizon. A fisherman from Weymouth, forbidden from taking his boat out due to military restrictions, stood on the harbor wall one morning trying to count American vessels. He reached 300 and gave up. There were more beyond those, more in adjacent anchorages, more arriving even as he watched. "I've fished these waters 40 years, he told a reporter who was equally stunned by what he was seeing. "Never seen anything like it, the water's gone. Just ships now as far as you can see." A man who'd spent for decades on those waters, who knew every current and every shoal, who could read weather in the clouds and fish in the waves, looked at his familiar ocean and couldn't find the water anymore. It had disappeared beneath hulls. It was about the types of vessels, the diversity of capabilities, the depth of planning that each ship represented. Admiral Sir Philip Vian, commanding the Eastern Task Force that would assault Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, made a tour of the American anchorages in early May. He needed to understand what capabilities his American counterparts were bringing to the operation, needed to coordinate fire support and logistics between British and American sectors. At Plymouth, his launch brought him alongside USS Nevada, and what he saw made him stop and stare. Sent to the bottom of the harbor by Japanese bombers in the attack that had brought America into the war. The Americans had raised her, towed her to dry dock, repaired her, refitted her, sailed her across the Pacific, through the Panama Canal, across the Atlantic, and brought her to Britain to support the invasion. Her 14-inch guns could throw a shell weighing 1,400 pounds more than 20 miles inland. "She's one of 3 battleships we're bringing," the American liaison officer explained as they toured Nevada's restored decks. "Texas and Arkansas are at Portland, plus we've got 3 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, and 34 destroyers assigned to the Western Task Force alone. That's not counting the vessels we're providing for fire support in the British sectors." The Americans were bringing more heavy naval gunfire support to their beaches than the entire Royal Navy had available for the 3 British beaches. And they were also providing significant support to British sectors on top of that. But the battleships and cruisers, impressive as they were, weren't what made the invasion possible. The landing craft were by late May. As D-Day approached, the final counts were becoming clear. LSTs, LCTs landing craft tank, each category with subcategories, each designed for specific purposes, each representing thousands of man-hours of design work and industrial production. They could cross the Atlantic under their own power, thousands of miles of open ocean, then beach themselves on D-Day, discharge their entire load directly onto sand, retract, and return to England for another load. The Americans had built over 1,000 of them. 1,000 ocean-going vessels, each capable of carrying multiple tanks, built in less than 2 years. Hundreds were now packed into British harbors, waiting for the order to load troops and head south. The LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, the small Higgins boats that would actually carry infantry to the beaches, numbered in the thousands. Each could carry 36 men or a jeep with crew. These weren't sophisticated vessels, they were essentially motorized boxes with ramps, but they were exactly what the invasion required, and the Americans had built them in quantities that defied comprehension. British officers who'd fought in the Mediterranean, who'd participated in the Sicily and Salerno landings, understood what this meant in practical terms. At Sicily, landing craft shortages had constrained the entire operation, had forced compromises in the assault plan, had limited what was tactically possible. Commanders had been forced to choose which units would land first, which would have to wait for the second wave, which might not land at all on the first day. For Overlord, there would be no shortage, no compromises forced by insufficient transport, no agonizing decisions about which units deserved priority. Captain John Hughes Hallett, a British naval officer who'd been involved in planning since the early days, stood on a hill overlooking Weymouth Bay in late May. The harbor below held more than 400 vessels. Beyond them, anchored in lines extending to the horizon, hundreds more waited. "We kept asking for landing craft," he said quietly to a colleague who joined him on the hill. Every planning session, every meeting with the Americans, the question was always the same: do we have enough landing craft? Can you build more landing craft? When will the landing craft arrive? At Dieppe, they'd scraped together enough landing craft for 5,000 men. Most had been destroyed or damaged. The raid had been a catastrophe, a bloody lesson in what happened when amphibious assaults were attempted without sufficient resources. Now, looking at the fleet below them, they were planning to land 156,000 men on the first day alone. The scale of American production was one thing. British planners had access to the numbers, understood American industrial capacity in theory. But the speed was what genuinely shocked them. British industry had been on war footing since September 1939, 5 years of total mobilization. 5 years of rationing, conscription, bombing, sacrifice. British shipyards were building vessels as fast as they possibly could, but they were also repairing battle damage from years of naval combat, maintaining existing fleets that were stretched thin across multiple theaters, dealing with material shortages caused by U-boat attacks on supply convoys. They were doing extraordinary work under impossible circumstances. American industry had ramped up to war production in half the time and was outproducing Britain by factors that seemed impossible even when you saw the evidence with your own eyes. A British logistics officer reviewing American production figures found numbers that made him recalculate 3 times, certain he'd made an error. In 1943 alone, American shipyards had launched more than 2,000 landing craft of various types. The Liberty ships, the standard American cargo vessels that were becoming ubiquitous in every port, were being completed at a rate of 3 per day across all American shipyards. 3 complete ocean-going cargo ships per day. Some individual yards were launching a completed vessel every 4 days from a single slipway. One yard had famously assembled a Liberty ship in less than 5 days as a publicity stunt, proving it could be done. "They're not building ships," one British officer observed after touring an American-run construction facility. "They're manufacturing them, like automobiles, like refrigerators. They've turned shipbuilding into an assembly line process." American shipyards had adopted mass production techniques that had been developed in automotive factories, techniques that British yards with their traditions of craftsmanship and individual attention to each vessel couldn't match. The Americans prefabricated sections in one location, assembled them in another, welded rather than riveted, prioritized speed over elegance. Admiral Ramsay held his final pre-invasion planning conference on May 28, 6 days before the scheduled assault. British, American, Canadian, and Free French naval commanders filled every chair, lined the walls, studied the massive map of the English Channel that dominated one wall. The map showed the Normandy coast in precise detail, with colored pins marking the positions of task forces, bombardment groups, transport areas, minesweeper lanes. It looked like a particularly complex board game, except each pin represented dozens or hundreds of real vessels. Ramsay stood before the map, a slight figure with the bearing of a man who'd spent his entire adult life at sea. Everyone in the room knew these numbers were coming, but hearing them spoken aloud was different. 6. The silence deepened. Every officer present understood naval logistics. They'd spent careers managing fleets, coordinating operations, calculating tonnages and capacities and fuel requirements. They knew these numbers represented not just ships, but the industrial capacity of multiple nations bent toward a single purpose. Of these, Ramsey continued, the American contribution is approximately 3,000 vessels, including the majority of our LSTs and a substantial portion of our fire support ships. Additionally, American vessels have been allocated to support British sectors, providing bombardment and transport capacity for our forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. Admiral Sir Harold Burrough, who would command one of the British task forces, spoke up from his seat. The last time England assembled a fleet this size was the Spanish Armada, and that was to defend against invasion, not launch one. Ramsey nodded slowly. The last time anyone assembled a fleet this size was never. Without their contribution, we'd be planning a much smaller operation, or no operation at all. Without the American fleet, Operation Overlord as planned would have been impossible. But the sweeping five-beach invasion, the overwhelming assault designed to crack the Atlantic Wall and establish a lodgment that couldn't be thrown back into the sea that required the American fleet. In the days before D-Day, British officers made final tour of their sectors, final inspections of the vessels that would carry their men to France. What they saw defied comprehension even for men who'd spent their lives at sea, who thought they understood what naval operations looked like. From Portland Bill, looking west, the sea was solid with ships, not crowded, not busy, solid. From Portsmouth looking east, the same. The Solent had become a steel channel, with vessels anchored so close their hulls nearly touched. A man could have walked from Portsmouth to the Isle of Wight by stepping from deck to deck, never touching water. Every harbor, every anchorage, every protected water on the southern coast held ships. Dartmouth was full, Salcombe was full, and still they kept arriving, each new convoy creating fresh challenges for harbor masters who'd long since exhausted their anchorage plans and were improvising solutions on the fly. On June 3rd, with the invasion just days away, a convoy of 47 American LSTs entered Plymouth Sound. The harbor master, who'd been awake for 36 hours straight coordinating anchorages and dealing with the endless logistics of keeping thousands of vessels supplied and organized, stared at his chart with eyes that burned from exhaustion. There was no more room, literally no more room. The harbor was full, the Sound was full, every designated anchorage was packed to capacity. He ordered them to anchor in a line extending out to sea, bow to stern, creating a floating pier of vessels stretching nearly to miles. The Americans complied without complaint, without questions, without protest. They'd been doing this for months now, parking their ships wherever space could be found, adapting to circumstances, waiting patiently for the order to load troops and head south. British troops, boarding their assigned vessels in early June, found themselves walking past American ships for hundreds of yards before reaching their own transports. The Americans lined their rails, watching the British embark, offering cigarettes and wisecracks and quiet words of encouragement. The rivalry between British and American forces was real, but so was the mutual respect, the shared understanding of what they were about to attempt together. A British sergeant leading his platoon up the gangway of a converted merchant ship looked back at the harbor one last time before going below. Ships in every direction, hundreds of them, thousands of them. A fleet that seemed to stretch to the horizon and beyond, that transformed the familiar geography of the English coast into something alien and overwhelming. Bloody hell, he muttered to his corporal. The Yanks really did bring everyone. The corporal, who'd fought in North Africa and Italy, who'd seen American forces arrive in those theaters with their abundance of equipment and supplies, nodded. They always do, Sarge. They always do. On June 4th, Eisenhower postponed the invasion 24 hours due to weather. Storms in the Channel had made the planned assault impossible. 6,939 vessels, many already loaded with troops who'd been confined to their ships to maintain operational security, waited. British port commanders, already stretched beyond capacity, now faced the challenge of keeping this massive fleet organized and supplied for an additional day. Fuel, food, water, medical supplies, ammunition all had to be distributed to thousands of vessels scattered across dozens of harbors. The logistics of feeding and supplying a fleet this size for a single extra day would have overwhelmed most military organizations. The Americans had anticipated this too. Their logistics ships, their supply vessels, their tankers were positioned to support the fleet through delays. When British commanders requested additional supplies for the postponement, American logistics officers simply consulted their manifests and began distribution. They'd brought enough for delays, they'd brought enough for contingencies. They'd brought enough for scenarios that hadn't even been war-gamed during planning. They think in terms of abundance, a British supply officer observed to his counterpart. We think in terms of scarcity. We calculate what we need and try to get it. They calculate what they need and then bring twice that much just in case something goes wrong. Then they bring more on top of that for contingencies they haven't even thought of yet. This wasn't criticism. It was recognition of two different military cultures shaped by two different national experiences. Britain had been fighting for 5 years. 5 years of bombing, blockade, rationing, sacrifice. Every resource was precious. Every ton of fuel or food had to be carefully allocated. Every decision weighed against competing priorities. The British military had become masters of economy, of doing more with less, of stretching limited resources to cover impossible requirements. America, untouched by bombing, with its factories running at full capacity, with its vast internal resources, thought differently. They brought excess because they could. They brought redundancy because they had it. They brought overwhelming force because that was their plan for winning, not clever economy, not brilliant improvisation with limited means, but simply bringing so much material that success became inevitable. On June 5th, the weather improved slightly. Eisenhower, after consulting with his meteorologists and weighing the risks of further delay against the dangers of assault in marginal conditions, gave the order. Operation Overlord was on. The fleet began to move. What happened next would stay with every British officer who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. 6,939 vessels, organized into 5 task forces, each task force divided into groups, each group divided into convoys, began moving south in a choreographed belly of steel and steam that had taken years to plan and months to position. The American Western Task Force under Admiral Kirk moved first from the western ports. Plymouth, Falmouth, Dartmouth all began emptying their packed harbors. LSTs, their boat doors closed, their decks loaded with vehicles and equipment secured under netting, moved into the channel in long lines. Each vessel maintained exact spacing, each captain following navigation plots that had been distributed weeks earlier. Behind them came the transports carrying the assault troops who would hit Utah and Omaha beaches. Above them, providing fire support, the battleships Nevada, Texas, and Arkansas took up their bombardment positions, their massive guns already trained toward the French coast. From the eastern ports, the British and Canadian forces moved simultaneously. Portsmouth, Shoreham, New Haven all released their vessels in the carefully orchestrated sequence that Ramsay had planned. The Eastern Task Force under Admiral Vian headed for Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, their own bombardment ships and landing craft following the same precise choreography. The channel became a highway of ships, multiple lanes of traffic, each lane moving at prescribed speeds, each vessel maintaining exact intervals. Minesweepers went first, clearing 10 channels through German minefields that had been laid over years of occupation. Behind them came the bombardment ships, then the transports, then the landing craft, then the follow-up waves, then the supply convoys. Each group timed to arrive at specific locations at specific moments, the entire operation synchronized like a vast machine with thousands of moving parts. Admiral Ramsay watched from HMS Largs as the fleet moved past his position. He'd planned this moment for 18 months. 18 months of meetings, conferences, arguments, compromises. 18 months of coordinating with dozens of commanders, reconciling thousands of conflicting requirements, solving countless logistical puzzles. 18 months of integrating British, American, Canadian, French, Polish, and Norwegian vessels into a single coordinated force. Now, watching it actually happen, watching thousands of ships moving with precision through the darkness toward the French coast, he allowed himself to feel something he rarely permitted, a cautious sense that this might actually work. "It's working," his chief of staff said quietly, standing beside him at the rail. The observation was almost unnecessary. They could see it working, but saying it aloud made it more real. Ramsay nodded slowly. "The Americans made it possible. We could never have built this fleet. Not in time, not in sufficient numbers. We could have planned brilliantly, coordinated perfectly, and it wouldn't have mattered without the ships to execute the plan." This wasn't diminishing British contributions. British vessels were essential. British planning was critical. British experience in combined operations, hard-won through years of smaller amphibious assaults, had shaped the entire operational concept. But the sheer industrial weight, the overwhelming material abundance that made the plan feasible, that transformed it from ambitious theory into executable reality, that came from America. A British destroyer commander, escorting a convoy of American LSTs toward the French coast, stood on his bridge watching the endless line of vessels ahead and behind. He tried counting them when the convoy first formed up, had reached 100 and stopped. There were more behind, more ahead, more in adjacent lanes. The sea itself seemed to have disappeared beneath hulls. "Sir," his navigation officer said quietly, "I've been in the Navy 16 years. The commander nodded without taking his eyes from the fleet ahead. "No one has, no one ever will again, probably. They're not going to need to do this again. After this works, if this works, say lines, just keep building on the lodgment until there is nothing left to invade." By dawn on June 6th, the fleet was in position off the Normandy coast. The bombardment ships opened fire at 0550 hours, their heavy guns hammering German positions with a violence that could be heard in southern England 40 miles away. The sound was continuous, a rolling thunder that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Shells weighing hundreds of pounds arced toward the French coast, their trajectories calculated by fire-controlled teams who'd been planning these bombardments for months. Nevada was firing her 14-inch guns at targets 12 miles inland. Each shell created explosions that sent debris hundreds of feet into the air that left craters large enough to hide a house. Texas and Arkansas were systematically destroying German bunkers and strongpoints, their fire controlled by spotter aircraft and coordinated with incredible precision. The Americans had brought enough ammunition to fire continuously for hours, enough to reduce every visible German position to rubble before the first troops hit the beaches. The landing craft went in at 0630 hours. Thousands of them, wave after wave, carrying troops to 5 beaches across a 50-mile front. The scale of the operation became clear in those first hours, became undeniable even through the chaos of combat. At Utah Beach, the American landing was almost unopposed initially. The bombardment had been so overwhelming, so sustained, that German defenders were still stunned when the first troops came ashore. And the troops kept coming, wave after wave of landing craft, each disgorging men and equipment onto the sand, then retracting to return for more. There was no pause, no waiting for the first wave to secure the beach before sending the second. The landing craft were so numerous that waves could be continuous, that the assault built momentum rather than stalling on the waterline. At Omaha, the story was different. German resistance was fierce, prepared, deadly. American troops took horrific casualties in the first hours, pinned down on the beach by machine gun fire from positions that had survived the bombardment. But even there, even in that nightmare, the fleet's contribution was decisive. More troops kept coming, more landing craft kept beaching. More fire support ships kept hammering German positions. The sheer number of American vessels offshore meant that even with heavy casualties, even with units pinned down and bleeding, Reinforcements kept arriving, supplies kept landing, fire support kept pounding German strongpoints. British commanders at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches had their own battles, their own casualties, their own moments of terror and triumph. But they were acutely aware that their operations were supported by American vessels, American landing craft, American fire support ships that had been allocated to British sectors. The abundance that characterized American operations extended to their allies, shared without hesitation or calculation of debt. By the end of D-Day, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore in France. The invasion had succeeded, not easily, not without terrible cost, not without moments when it seemed the whole enterprise might fail. But it had succeeded, and it had succeeded because the fleet that delivered those troops was large enough, capable enough, numerous enough to overwhelm German defenses through sheer material abundance. In the days and weeks that followed, the fleet continued its work with the same relentless efficiency that had characterized its assembly. The landing craft made repeated trips, shuttling back and forth across the channel, bringing reinforcements, supplies, equipment, vehicles. By the end of June, over 850,000 troops had been landed in Normandy, along with 148,000 vehicles and 570,000 tons of supplies. Think about that, 570,000 tons. That's more cargo than most nations possessed in their entire military inventory. And it had all been transported across the English Channel in 3 weeks, delivered by a fleet that seemed capable of moving anything, anywhere, in whatever quantities were required. The American vessels that had packed British harbors for months were now engaged in sustained operations that would have broken smaller fleets. They ran continuous shuttles, maintained tight schedules, coordinated with military requirements that changed hourly. And they did it all with a matter-of-fact competence that made it look routine. British officers watching this sustained logistical operation understood something that wouldn't be fully articulated until after the war. Something that would shape their understanding of what had actually happened in 1944. America hadn't just contributed to the invasion. America had made the invasion possible on the scale required for success. Without the American fleet, there would have been no D-Day. Or rather, there would have been some smaller operation, some limited assault that would likely have been thrown back into the sea with catastrophic losses. The overwhelming success of Overlord was built on overwhelming material superiority, and that superiority came from American factories, American shipyards, American industrial capacity operating at a scale no other nation could match. Admiral Ramsey, in his final report on Operation Neptune, was characteristically precise in his assessment. The success of the operation was dependent upon the availability of sufficient landing craft and naval vessels to transport and support the assault forces. The American contribution of approximately 3,000 vessels, including the majority of the specialized landing craft, was essential to achieving the required scale of assault. Without this contribution, the operation would not have been feasible as planned. This was the measured language of official reports, the careful phrasing of a senior officer writing for the historical record. But in private conversations, in letters home, in memoirs written years later, British officers were more direct about what they'd witnessed. "We knew they were rich," one British captain wrote in a letter to his wife after the war. "We knew they had factories and resources we didn't have. Everyone knew America was wealthy. But knowing it and seeing it are entirely different things. Seeing thousands of ships all built in the last 2 years, all brought across the Atlantic, all positioned exactly where they needed to be, all working together with mechanical efficiency, that was when you understood what American industrial power actually meant. It meant they could decide to build a fleet larger than anything in history and then just do it in less time than it took us to repair the ships we already had." Another British officer, reflecting on the build-up decades later, put it more simply: "We'd been fighting for 5 years with what we had, making do, stretching resources, improvising brilliantly when we had to. The Americans showed up and built what was needed. Not built with what they had, built what was needed from scratch. Different approach entirely, different scale. Different kind of war. The fleet that had filled British harbors in the spring of 1944 represented more than ships and tonnage and industrial capacity. It represented a fundamental shift in how the war would be fought. For 5 years, Britain had fought with limited resources, careful allocation, strategic economy. Every operation had been planned around constraints, around what was possible with available forces, around making the most of limited means. The arrival of American forces brought a different philosophy, not economy, but abundance. Not careful allocation, but overwhelming material superiority applied continuously until the enemy collapsed under the sheer weight of it. Not brilliant improvisation with insufficient means, but methodical execution with more than enough of everything. British generals and admirals, watching the American fleet assemble, had understood this intellectually. The numbers were in the reports, the plans were coordinated. The allocations were agreed upon, they knew what was coming. But there's a difference between knowing and understanding, between reading numbers in a planning document and standing on a harbor wall watching those numbers transform into still reality. The shock, if that's even the right word for it, wasn't surprise. British commanders weren't caught off guard. They'd known the Americans were coming with substantial forces. The shock was the gap between expectation and reality, between understanding something would be large and experiencing exactly how large it actually was, between approving 3,000 vessels on a manifest and watching them fill every harbor on the southern coast until the sea itself disappeared beneath hulls. They asked for an invasion fleet. The Americans had delivered an armada that made the Spanish Armada look like a coastal patrol. They'd asked for landing craft. The Americans had built them by the thousand and parked them so densely in British harbors that you could walk from one side to the other without touching water. They'd asked for fire support. The Americans had brought battleships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, raised from the bottom, repaired, and sailed halfway around the world to participate. The British had been planning Operation Overlord since 1943, calculating requirements, coordinating forces, preparing for the largest amphibious assault in history. They knew what was needed. They'd done the math. They'd understood the scope of the operation. And then the Americans had shown up and exceeded every calculation, brought more than anyone thought possible, made it all look routine. That was what British generals and admirals saw when they looked at the American invasion fleet in the spring of 1944. Not just ships. Not just impressive logistics, they saw the physical manifestation of a nation's industrial will concentrated on a single objective and applied with overwhelming force. They saw what happened when American factories, American workers, American organizational capacity decided to build something. They saw victory made inevitable not through brilliant tactics or strategic genius, but through simple, crushing material superiority. And they understood, watching those ships fill the horizon, watching them move south in perfect coordination toward the French coast, watching them deliver 156,000 troops in a single day, and then keep delivering reinforcements for weeks afterward. They understood that this was how the war would be won. Not through clever economy or brilliant improvisation or strategic finesse. Through overwhelming industrial might applied without restraint until nothing remained to oppose it. The American fleet didn't just make D-Day possible, it made D-Day inevitable. And that, more than anything else, was what took British officers' breath away when they looked at their transformed harbors in the spring of 1944.